The American Civil War was a time of blood, iron, and desperation. Between 1861 and 1865, soldiers faced not only death on the battlefield, but punishments that came from their own commanders. Among these punishments was one of the most excruciating methods ever adopted, the dreaded wooden horse. The wooden horse was not born in America. Its cruel design came from European armies centuries earlier, where discipline was maintained through sheer terror. Spanish, French, and German militaries all used the device to keep soldiers in line. When the Civil War erupted, both Union and Confederate forces inherited this cruel legacy. The structure itself was deceptively simple. A beam, often sharpened to a narrow ridge, was placed high above the ground. Soldiers or prisoners were forced to straddle it as though it were a horse, their legs dangling painfully on either side. But the real horror came when weights were tied to their ankles. With each passing minute, the sharp edge cut deeper into the victim's flesh. Blood circulation was crushed, skin tore, and muscles screamed. The punishment was not intended to kill outright, but it was meant to break spirits, destroy dignity, and cripple a man long after he came down. In Civil War camps, military law was brutal. Desertion, drunkenness, insubordination, or even petty theft could bring the sentence of the wooden horse. Soldiers feared it more than flogging or confinement. The device mocked their manhood, shamed them before their comrades, and left scars that no medal of honor could erase. The Union Army, desperate to maintain order among its swelling ranks of volunteers, quickly adopted the method. Officers in camps from Virginia to Tennessee used the wooden horse as a public spectacle. Rows of soldiers were forced to watch as their comrade writhed in agony, ensuring the lesson was burned into every mind. The Confederacy was no different. Short on resources, Southern commanders often improvised their versions of the wooden horse. Rough planks, fence beams, or even sharpened logs were transformed into instruments of suffering. For Confederate deserters, it was not only punishment but also a reminder that betrayal came at a steep price. For prisoners of war, the torment was even worse. Northern and Southern prisons alike became infamous for their cruelty. Andersonville, the notorious Confederate prison camp in Georgia, saw countless captives subjected to humiliations, with the wooden horse among them. Men already weakened by starvation and disease were broken further by this punishment. Eyewitnesses described scenes of horror. Prisoners groaned and bit their lips until they bled, refusing to scream lest they be mocked. Others passed out, collapsing into unconsciousness as their bodies gave out. Some never recovered their ability to walk properly. Yet the guards remained unmoved, insisting that discipline required such measures. The wooden horse was not always a solitary punishment. In some cases, multiple men were forced to straddle the same beam at once. Their cries blended together, creating a chorus of suffering that echoed through the camp. The spectacle was meant not just for the victims, but for every soldier standing in fearful silence. Though it had European roots, Americans added their own cruel variations. Sometimes sandbags or stones were tied to the victim's feet, pulling them downward until the skin split. Other times the men were forced to hold muskets outstretched in their hands while balanced on the beam, adding further torment to the punishment. The physical pain was only one part of the ordeal. The wooden horse carried with it an immense sense of humiliation. Soldiers prided themselves on courage and endurance, but this punishment reduced them to trembling wrecks, unable to sit, stand, or walk without agony. Their comrades watched, silently grateful it was not their turn. What made the wooden horse so terrifying was its uncertainty. Unlike a hanging or a bullet, no one knew how long the punishment would last. Sometimes it was 15 minutes. Other times, hours passed before the victim was finally released. Each extra moment brought them closer to permanent injury. Doctors of the time recorded cases of soldiers left impotent, crippled, or suffering from lifelong groin injuries. Infection was common, especially in prison camps where disease already ran rampant. A man punished on the wooden horse could be doomed not only to physical agony, but to a slow, lingering decline. Despite its brutality, commanders defended the practice. They argued that discipline must be maintained at any cost. Without order, armies would crumble into chaos. Fear was a tool of survival, and the wooden horse was a weapon of obedience. For many officers, it was a necessary evil, but not everyone agreed. Letters from soldiers revealed disgust at the cruelty of their own side. Some men wrote home to their families, describing with horror what they had witnessed. They questioned whether America, a nation supposedly fighting for freedom, should allow such barbarism within its own ranks. Yet the wooden horse persisted. It appeared in training camps, battlefield encampments, and prison yards across the nation. North and south, rich and poor, officer and private, none were safe from its reach. It became a symbol of discipline, fear, and the darker side of military justice during the Civil War. By the war's end, countless men had felt its sharp edge dig into their flesh. Some limped away scarred but alive, while others were left broken in body and spirit. The legacy of the wooden horse was one of agony, humiliation, and the grim reminder that war often destroys its own before the enemy can. The origins of this punishment show how cruelty travels through time. From Europe's old armies to America's blood-soaked fields, the wooden horse stood as proof that discipline often walked hand in hand with suffering, and in the chaos of the Civil War, its shadow loomed large over every soldier who dared defy command. The wooden horse was not merely a punishment, it was a slow unraveling of human strength. To sit astride it was to face a trial that tested the body, the will, and the very soul of the condemned soldier. It was an ordeal so dreadful that many described it as worse than battle itself. The process began with the condemned marched before his fellow soldiers or fellow prisoners. His crime would be announced: drunkenness, desertion, or some slight against authority. The punishment was meant to be public, so the humiliation began long before his body touched the beam. The device itself was simple but cruelly effective. A triangular plank, narrow at the top, stood at waist or chest height. It looked harmless at first glance, just wood and nails. But to straddle its sharp edge was to be cut apart slowly from within. The prisoner knew this before he even mounted. Guards or officers would order the victim to climb up, sometimes with assistance, sometimes by sheer force. Once seated, there was no turning back. The edge pressed immediately into the groin, sending shocks of pain radiating through the thighs and abdomen. The body instinctively tried to shift, but the beam allowed no relief. Weights were then tied to the ankles. Iron balls, sandbags, or even buckets filled with stones dragged downward with merciless force. Each added pound drove the ridge deeper into flesh, tearing muscle and crushing nerves. What had started as discomfort quickly became agony. The victim's face would contort, jaw clenched tight against a scream. Some tried to keep their dignity, biting their lips until blood trickled down their chin. Others cried openly, sobs echoing across the camp. Laughter from guards or jeers from unsympathetic comrades only deepened the shame. Minutes stretched into eternity. 10 minutes felt like an hour. 30 minutes felt like a lifetime. The sharp wood pressed so deep that some men swore they could feel their bones grinding against the beam. A numbness would begin to spread, followed by searing fire in the legs. Eyewitnesses described soldiers fainting, their bodies slumping only to be dragged harder against the edge by the weights on their ankles. Some had to be revived with water, only to be forced back into place until the allotted time was done. The punishment gave no mercy to weakness. The wooden horse was designed to cripple. When a victim was finally released, he often collapsed into the dirt, unable to stand. His legs trembled, his groin and thighs swollen and bruised, sometimes bleeding through torn trousers. For some, walking became impossible for days, even weeks. The humiliation was just as brutal as the physical torment. Soldiers were stripped of their pride as they writhed helplessly in front of their peers. In a culture where masculinity and honor were prized above all, to be reduced to tears and screams was worse than a bullet wound. In Union prison camps, guards sometimes used the wooden horse not only as punishment, but as a cruel form of entertainment. Prisoners, already starving and disease-ridden, were forced to straddle the beam while others were made to watch. Their torment was a reminder of who held power inside the fences. Confederate soldiers described similar horrors. In makeshift camps, fence posts or rails served as the horse. Victims came down bleeding and unable to march the next day. Some were left so damaged that they never returned to the battlefield, crippled by the very army they had sworn to serve. Accounts from survivors tell of lasting damage. One Union soldier wrote that after being subjected to the wooden horse, He could not walk without pain for months. Another prisoner recalled seeing a man permanently impotent after the ordeal. What was meant as discipline often turned into lifelong mutilation. Psychological terror played its part as well. The sight of a fellow soldier writhing in pain was enough to silence disobedience in others. Men obeyed orders, not out of loyalty, but out of fear that they too might one day feel the sharp bite of the wooden horse. Other punishments, such as flogging, the ball and chain, or bucking and gagging, were dreaded but predictable. The wooden horse, however, carried an aura of horror because it destroyed from within. Soldiers never knew if they would walk again, if they would ever be whole again after being forced upon it. The ordeal often left invisible scars. Men who had endured the beam spoke of nightmares and shame long after the war ended. The punishment attacked their dignity as much as their flesh, stripping away the soldier's sense of self-worth. Even those who survived intact carried the memory like a wound that never closed. The spectacle was deliberate. Officers and guards knew that every scream, every collapse, and every broken man was a warning to others. Discipline was bought with blood, groans, and humiliation. The wooden horse was not just punishment, it was theater, designed to terrify an audience as much as to destroy its victim. For many who witnessed it, the image never left their minds. Soldiers recounted years later the sight of comrades trembling and pale, sliding off the beam like broken dolls. They remembered the silence that followed, when no man dared to disobey again. Fear had been successfully planted. The wooden horse was more than a device of pain. It was a symbol of the extremes to which armies would go to enforce order during the chaos of civil war. It left men crippled in body, crushed in spirit, and haunted in memory. The battlefield was deadly, but for some the wooden horse was far worse. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the wooden horse did not vanish overnight. For years after, stories of its use lingered among veterans who carried not only the scars of battle, but also the wounds of punishment inflicted by their own commanders. It remained a shadow in their memories, a reminder that cruelty often came from within. The war had left America divided, not only politically but morally. Citizens who read letters from soldiers or spoke to returning veterans began to question the methods used to maintain order in the camps. The wooden horse, once defended as a necessary discipline, was increasingly viewed as a mark of unnecessary barbarity. One of the strongest criticisms came from survivors of prison camps. Union soldiers who had endured Andersonville, or Confederate soldiers released from northern prisons, wrote of the punishment in vivid detail. Their testimonies shocked civilians who were unprepared for the extent of suffering endured by their countrymen. Some military leaders defended its use even after the war. They argued that in the chaos of battle and the constant threat of desertion, only the harshest punishments could hold an army together. In their eyes, the wooden horse was not cruelty, it was survival. Without it, they claimed, discipline would have collapsed. But the medical evidence told another story. Surgeons and doctors recorded long-term injuries in men who had been subjected to the punishment. Crippled legs, torn muscles, and permanent damage to the groin were common. These were not temporary lessons in obedience. They were lifelong sentences of pain. As America moved further into the Reconstruction era, public sentiment shifted. Newspapers began publishing accounts of wartime cruelty, including the use of the wooden horse. Reformers called for military justice to evolve beyond medieval methods. The nation, still reeling from the immense death toll of the war, had little appetite for further cruelty. By the late 19th century, the wooden horse largely disappeared from American military practice. Courts-martial still delivered harsh sentences, but the spectacle of straddling a sharpened beam fell out of favor. The punishment had earned its reputation as both ineffective and unnecessarily brutal. Still, its memory endured. Veterans would recall the punishment in memoirs and stories told to their families. For some, it remained a symbol of humiliation greater than any battlefield defeat. To admit that one had been placed upon the wooden horse was to reveal a shame that never truly faded. The wooden horse also became a point of comparison for later historians studying the brutality of war. It stood alongside flogging, branding, and the ball and chain as a symbol of the extremes armies would employ in the name of discipline. It revealed a darker truth, that cruelty was not always the work of the enemy, but often the hand of one's own side. In time, the punishment entered the broader history of military torture, remembered less as a specific Civil War practice and more as part of a long chain of inhumanity passed down from Europe to America. It was a reminder that even a nation fighting for freedom could resort to methods that stripped men of their dignity. Today, the wooden horse is rarely mentioned in school books or museums. It sits in the margins of Civil War history, overshadowed by great battles and famous generals. Yet for the men who endured it, the memory was not marginal. It was central, etched into their bodies and their minds forever. The legacy of the wooden horse lies not only in its cruelty, but in the questions it left behind. How far should armies go to enforce discipline? When does punishment become abuse? And how do nations reconcile the suffering inflicted on their own soldiers in the name of order? The answers remain uneasy, but one truth stands clear. The wooden horse was more than a plank of wood. It was a weapon of fear, humiliation, and permanent injury. In the blood-soaked years of the Civil War, it became a symbol of the high cost of obedience, one that often destroyed the very men it sought to control.